Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact.
If you want to grow the reach, revenue, and impact of your learning business, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast. If you're leading or working in a learning business today, chances are you're making decisions in an environment that feels more demanding and less forgiving than it used to be. More pressure, more noise, and fewer clear signals about what actually makes a difference.
In those conditions, it's natural to rely on familiar instincts, work harder, add new offerings, gather more data, keep things moving.
And we'll say we ourselves are very much a part of this world. We offer events, programs, and courses. So this isn't about pointing fingers. It's about instincts we've had to question in our own work at Leading Learning and Tagoras, and what we see across many learning businesses we work with through consulting and other avenues.
The challenge is that some of our instincts, while well-intentioned, can quietly work against the outcomes we care most about. Clarity, resilience, and meaningful impact, for example.
So in this episode, we want to focus not on what learning business leaders should do more of, but what they may need to stop doing.
We'll talk about a set of common habits that tend to show up when things feel uncertain, why they're so tempting, how they can create unintended consequences, and what becomes possible when leaders step back and let go of a few things that no longer serve them.
Because sometimes the most valuable leadership move isn't adding something new, it's deciding what to stop doing.
And so we want to talk about some things to stop doing because we are seeing this pattern in our own work that we are involved in ourselves and in where we bump up against the work of other learning businesses. And that is the fact that really well-intentioned responses that maybe even worked very well in the past, are actually increasing fragility, increasing anxiety, adding to the noise now.
And so in the past, we've talked about VUCA, that acronym that stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We thought this would be a good time to introduce a newer, but by no means new framing that really goes to this question of fragility, anxiety, noise, and that's BANI, which stands for brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible.
And we're not going to do a deep dive on BANI, but we think it's a useful backdrop for why some of the things that used to serve no longer serve learning businesses as well. And I think it can also offer some helpful language for a lot of what we're seeing and experiencing. And as you said, Jeff, it's not a purely new framing. It was introduced around 2018 by a futurist, Jamais Cascio, and it really then gained even wider attention during the pandemic. But it does seem to me that it's still, here we are in 2026, very relevant and valuable to, again, use as sort of a backdrop and a framing for what we'll talk about.
Yeah, definitely plenty of anxiety still going around. And, BANI is often described as an evolution of VUCA. So it doesn't replace it so much as it sort of sharpens what VUCA doesn't fully capture anymore, especially the emotional and structural fragility of our systems.
So we'll just unpack each of those letters a little bit more. So B, as you said, Jeff, stands for brittle. And one of the takeaways here is that systems that look strong and look very efficient can actually break pretty readily under stress. And that brittleness isn't necessarily obvious, but it becomes dramatically obvious the moment that something snaps, something stops working.
Right. So in organizations, brittleness often shows up as a dependence on a few key people, say some subject matter experts, or over reliance on a particular vendor or system like your LMS, for example, or just a lack of slack in the system or redundancy.
Right. And we mentioned VUCA. So VUCA talks about volatility. BANI really highlights the fragility that happens in the world today. A stands for anxious. And this isn't our own individual personal anxiety, although that often
shows up there, though.
exists. But this is about anxiety as a systemic condition.
So when people don't understand what's happening or what comes next, anxiety drives reactive decisions and encourages simply doing something over making what can be hard choices.
And so a lot of leaders are experiencing anxiety at that personal level, and then they're often unintentionally transmitting it to the other folks in their learning business, those around them. And so a lot of organizational behavior begins to make more sense when you see it through this lens of anxiety that's driving a lot of the decisions and a lot of the activity.
Yeah, the whole organization can start to feel anxious. And if it's a brittle organization, then you've got that B and A going together. And then we get to N, non-linear, which, the root of that is that cause and effect don't scale predictably. You can be in situations where small actions can have an outsized impact. And conversely, big investments just go nowhere.
So patterns that once felt reliable stop working. So maybe past approaches to pricing or past approaches to promotion or ways that you used to drive engagement. Maybe all of those used to work, but they're beginning to no longer be something that you can count on. And so this is where perhaps some of those familiar planning instincts can start to mislead us because we think we just need to do more of what we did in the past.
Right. And then finally, we get to I, the incomprehensible. So, many systems are now just too complex and really kind of opaque to fully understand. AI, of course, is the glaring example of that. And even with data, it can be hard to explain why something is happening.
So, right, we can spend all this time gathering data points, but we still don't really know what to make of it. And it can feel incomprehensible. And in an incomprehensible world, it's not that nothing makes sense. It's just that it's very hard to sort of see how everything fits together and how the whole fits and makes sense in an overarching way.
So those are the components of BANI. And if you buy this idea that the world is more brittle, more anxious, more nonlinear, and more incomprehensible, then it just stands to reason that some of the things learning business leaders do out of habit may actually make things worse now. So we want to talk about what we might need to stop doing.
So our number one stop doing is to stop optimizing primarily for efficiency. Efficiency can actually cause or increase brittleness because if you have a system that's really optimized for efficiency, that means it can also often break under stress. So just to unpack that a little bit, think about thin staffing, right? Because you've gotten really efficient, so you've sort of honed it down to just the bare skeleton staff that you need. But then when you have that thin staffing, then there's very little slack. So if something comes up, you don't necessarily have a way to react. Again, with efficiency, you can maybe have that dependency on somebody who has just done a lot for the organization in the past. They're the veteran who's been there, who knows how to do it all. But again, when they get ready to leave, then that leaves the system very susceptible to breaking, to brittleness. And maybe another example, you have efficiency where you really have these processes to get products launched. You're really buttoned up. You have all these steps that you follow, but that can create long timelines, for example. So those are just some ways that being efficient, which is often seen as a benefit, can actually increase the brittleness of the system being your learning business in this case.
Right. And so, if you feel like you're experiencing any of those things, and I think most organizations are experiencing at least some of those things, there's some questions that you might want to use for prompting conversation. So one of these would be, where is efficiency quietly reducing resilience in our learning business? So look around, do you have those processes that were once a good thing, once were very efficient, but now we're stretching things out forever, particularly if you've got thin staffing and little slack?
And then another question we offer for your consideration is, what happens when one of your key assumptions fails? So this is going to require you to really make sure that you're aware of the key assumptions behind how you operate, and then really look at where is the breaking point, or which of those assumptions might most easily make you susceptible to breaking down to brittleness.
So that was our first area to consider, stopping optimizing primarily for efficiency. Let's look at stop number 2, and that would be stop adding products to relieve anxiety. So stop defaulting to just putting new things into your catalog, into your portfolio of offerings.
And that's because adding more offerings may actually reflect your anxiety rather than learner need. So getting products added to your portfolio, that can feel kind of like a safe move. It's helping you be more diversified. But what if those additions aren't actually meaningfully diversified? What if it's more of the same? And what if they aren't being vetted appropriately to really assess current learner needs and current learner demand? And so that can create then portfolio sprawl. And once you have portfolio sprawl, that can also create or at least contribute to learner confusion. They're not sure which of your products are going to help them on their journey.
And we all know how this plays out. I mean, you get pressure for more offerings from a lot of different sources, board members, your organizational members and learners, other areas of the organization, competitors, vendors. I mean, we're in a time right now where everybody's saying we got to add something about AI to our catalog. We got to add AI. We got to add AI. But that may cause more anxiety than actual benefit for the organization if you haven't taken the time to kind of slow down and think about what really needs to happen there.
And I think, again, that doing something, taking action, often feels like what you should be doing. And there's a false comfort, though, in that push to always be adding. Because again, this episode, we're talking about what to stop doing. So this is a chance to see the fact that sometimes not doing something or opting not to create that new product might actually be the best move.
So some conversation prompts on this one. One would be, how often is product expansion a coping mechanism for our learning business rather than something we're actually doing really strategically?
And then what does doing something feel like compared to making a hard choice? And again, that question is about feeling. So it's acknowledging the fact that sometimes doing something can feel beneficial, can feel like you're doing the right thing, and making a hard choice can feel hard. But you want to be clear that you're aware of those emotions and then factoring them into how you do make decisions, which might mean, again, not doing something and instead making that hard choice to stop doing something. Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact. So those are 2 areas to stop in so far. Stop optimizing primarily for efficiency and stop adding products to relieve anxiety. You might just be creating more anxiety and not getting good effect in doing that. The third item would be stop expecting linear relationships.
And to unpack that a little bit, what we mean is that inputs and outputs are no longer as predictable as they used to. So just as a few kind of generic examples, more marketing, more promotion of a particular product does not necessarily result in higher enrollments.
I think most organizations recognize that at this point. They've been experiencing it. More content does not necessarily equate to more impact. higher prices does not necessarily correlate to lower demand, and the reverse may or may not be true as well. Lowering prices doesn't necessarily increase demand, increase sales of your products. There just is not that linear relationship.
And so once you stop long enough to realize that some of these relationships are no longer as predictable as perhaps they were in the past, that can lead you to some questions that you might want to consider. So one is around, where have you seen small moves produce outsized impact? So look back over what you've done over the last 12 months and see, where were you able to sort of just tinker a little bit, but actually have a profound change, whether that's in enrollment or in the impact you're having on the learners, or however you choose to measure that impact.
Yeah, I love this question. It's a great one for strategic reflection, both as an individual and very powerfully as a group. Looking back on that, where were those bright spots, maybe some that were unexpected, that you want to figure out how you can potentially replicate going forward. On the other hand, you want to look at where have your big investments really gone nowhere. They just did not produce the kind of results that you were looking for. And then just asking overall, how does linear thinking affect and limit your forecasting and goal settings? That expectation that input in is going to create an equal output. Where are you sort of bringing that bias to your planning when you need to maybe be thinking differently at this point?
And I think a key takeaway here is that you really want to acknowledge that it's hard to forecast with great precision. So you're going to need to sort of let go that need to know. And what you want to focus on more is learning loops in your own learning business. Based on what you're doing, what you're seeing, what you're trying, what are the results of that? What does that tell you about what you might want to try next month, next quarter? But it's sort of a continuous learning cycle and refinement of what you're doing.
So that was number 3, to stop expecting linear relationships. Number 4, or stop number 4, is to stop chasing certainty before making decisions.
And that's because certainty probably isn't coming.
No.
So you might be waiting a long time. And while you're waiting for that elusive certainty, you're actually making a choice because you're defaulting to continuing the status quo.
Yeah, and I think this one can be particularly tricky these days because you hear so much about wanting to be a data-driven organization. We're going to get data. We're going to get data. We're going to do everything based on data. And you should do that. We're not saying don't get data, but you're never going to get the perfect data. You're never going to get the clear visibility into the future. And with AI being a factor right now, the data you get now could change pretty significantly, pretty rapidly, just because of the impact that AI is having.
Yeah, so data gaps are unavoidable. You're never going to have that perfect data set. Data is almost always a snapshot of the past, so it's already sort of limited use as you're thinking about the future. And so what you're doing while you're sort of continuing to collect data or looking to fill any of those gaps or digging in and analyzing and then reanalyzing is that maybe you're actually avoiding. You're sort of putting things off rather than making a decision. And so what you need to do is begin to do something, because sometimes leaders treat choices as these big, irreversible, long-term commitments. But in reality, if you take the view that those choices are uncertain, they're based on incomplete information, and you have to try them to know how they're going to turn out, then that sort of opens up an experiment mindset that can let you test things out. It can make it easier to make a choice and try it rather than sort of waiting for that perfect certainty before you decide what you're going to do, whether that's releasing a new product, sunsetting a product, whatever it is.
Right. And I mean, and this is a perspective we've advocated forever, long before we came around to this BANI framework that we're talking about today. You've got to be willing to, for example, launch without perfect data. So you don't want to continually say, we need more data before launching. You can't know the market response in advance. You can get some signals, but you got to put something out there to test it, that minimum viable product, and do it with the knowledge that a decision is reversible. You can change pricing, you can change format, you can set yourself up so that you're going to be testing in ways that aren't putting you all in and are getting you that actual market response to then build from.
Right. And similarly, sometimes learning businesses can get too caught up in the need to decide on a format, for example. So should we have a cohort-based program, or should we have this as a self-paced online offering? And it's important to remember that both options can be piloted. And so the downside of being wrong is limited. So again, if you can just get past treating it as a one-time permanent decision, it really can help to decrease your anxiety when you see this as something that we're going to try, we're going to experiment with, we're going to learn. And by pushing ahead, that can help you, again, decrease the anxiety and actually speed up the learning, that learning loop that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. And we often, hear from organizations that experiments sound risky. Everybody's worried about hurting their reputation. And very often organizations aren't set up to experiment very well. So delay just becomes the safest seeming option. But, this is a case where you don't want to delay. You want to stop delaying, basically, and get something out there so you can see some actual results.
Right, because the delay does carry real costs,
Right.
even though it might feel safe in the moment to sort of not make that choice and maybe feel a little bit more professional, a little bit more buttoned up by saying we're going to get more data, we're going to analyze this more. But again, often that delay is really just avoidance of making a choice of trying that experiment and learning from it.
So some conversation prompts around this one. Ask yourself, ask your team, where does that we need more data type perspective really hide fear more than anything else?
Yeah, anxiety, the anxiety that we've been talking
right.
about. And sort of related to that too, then be clear with yourself, be clear with your team about how do you decide what's knowable enough. So like you're not going to get to perfect insight, but what's sort of good enough to help you make decisions and pull the trigger on those experiments.
And a final one, ask yourself what decisions are reversible, but we might be treating them as permanent.
And so, here a takeaway for me is just that good judgment really matters more than perfect information, because you're not going to get that perfect information. In this incomprehensible world that BANI describes, this lack of knowing, that's just a fact. That's a feature of the world and environment in which we work. And so you have to accept that and then figure out how to act, given that there is so much that's undefined and incomprehensible.
So let's go to our fifth and final thing to stop doing. And there are probably more than 5 in most organizations, but we're gonna stop at 5 today. And number 5 for us is stop treating stability as the goal.
Stability is fleeting at best. Most systems might reach sort of that perfect stasis equilibrium, but they're not going to remain there. And so rather than aiming for stability, you should aim for adaptability.
Yeah, and I think there's always this idea that if we get to this destination that we've described, we're kind of done. Then we can rest on our laurels. Everything's going to be good from there on out. That's almost never the case in the best of circumstances. It's certainly not the case in the circumstances we have right now. You hear a lot about how do we get back to normal or establish that new normal, as if there's a destination we can get to there that's going to now be fixed. Just doesn't happen.
And so a danger here is that you're overinvesting in fixed structures when those fixed structures aren't really well suited to the shifting sands of the current environment.
Yeah, for me, one is to continue to build out traditional courses without stepping back and thinking about maybe that's not the structure for learning going forward. Do we need to do something else? Kind of related to this is an underinvestment in sense-making skills. So how do we encourage the kind of reflection, the kind of curiosity, the skills that are going to help people see things differently, develop new knowledge that might lead them to what is next beyond these current structures that we've invested so much in?
So some questions you might ask of yourself and your team. First, what does a healthy learning business look like for you now?
And then how does leadership change when volatility is assumed? If you're leading a learning business, what does that look like in this really volatile environment?
And then what capabilities matter most when any plans you make are going to age very, very quickly? So I think the takeaway here is just that your ability to learn as a team within your learning business and your resilience, those are much more important and much more admirable goals than any sort of stability or equilibrium.
And so maybe to wrap up, now that we've covered our 5 stops, we can talk a little bit about what they have in common. And one thing I would say is that these aren't tactics, really. I mean, they involve specific actions maybe, but they're mostly their mindset shifts.
That's right. So we're talking about moving from the idea of control to judgment. And so where can you exercise better judgment? You're unlikely to be able to have the control over your market, over your learners, over the world. And so it's better to focus on judgment and making sure that you're assessing the situation accurately, that you're using that good judgment to determine how you do respond.
And then as part of that, setting yourself up, not so much for efficiency, that kind of lockstep, here's how we get the catalog out, here's how we get the meeting set up and the way we've always done it, moving from efficiency to resilience. So as you are encountering all of this volatility that we're talking about, you have ways to respond to that not only help you to survive it, but even possibly to grow, to become stronger from it. This is kind of the concept of anti-fragility, which I think is a good one to spice in here from Nassim Taleb. I think a lot of what we're talking about points to how can we be not just resilient, but anti-fragile as an organization.
And there's also a mindset shift from motion to meaning. So by motion, it's like we're talking about all the activities, where you're sometimes just caught up in the we're going to get this done. We're going to get that new course out. We're going to have the conference. We're going to do it on repeat. And so rather than getting caught up in that activity and that motion, really thinking about meaning and where is what you're doing having the most impact and what should you be focusing on? What should you be doing? Being a little bit more judicial in what you are focused on.
Right. And certainly why is an important question to ask us part of that repeatedly. And then finally, we'd say, moving from certainty, which there's so little of these days, moving from certainty into learning and ongoing sense making. Again, something we've advocated for years is the way that learning business professionals, learning business leaders should operate, kind of walking the walk, but more important than ever now, it feels like.
Yeah. So environments like those described by BANI, so brittle and anxious and nonlinear and incomprehensible. In those contexts, leadership is less about having answers and it's more about choosing better questions and choosing better constraints, better limitations that are going to actually help you focus on what you need to do to deliver the greatest impact to those that you serve.
And so we'll leave you with one final question that you may want to ask of yourself personally, or if you have a team, we encourage you to consider this with your team. And that is, what's one thing you might stop doing, and what would that make possible? When learning business leaders operate in environments that are noisy, pressured, and hard to read, it's easy to default to habits that feel productive, even when they don't lead to good outcomes.
Taking time to question those habits can create space for better judgment and more intentional decisions. So take time to examine where efficiency might be undermining resilience, where motion might be masking anxiety, and where certainty is being chased at the expense of sense-making.
Stopping some things doesn't mean doing less leadership. It often means making room for clearer thinking about what deserves attention, investment, and care.
You can find show notes, a transcript, and related resources at leadinglearning.com/episode 477.
And if you find the Leading Learning podcast valuable, please consider sharing this episode or another with a colleague or coworker.
Thanks for listening, and see you next time on the Leading Learning podcast.